What if I told you that there was one simple idea that if you grasped it, it would explain everything that your watercolor paint did after you applied it to your paper? That's what we're talking about in today's video. So today we're talking about something called viscosity. It basically means how thick or thin a liquid is. It's really important when it comes to watercolor painting, and it actually explains everything that happens to your paint, whether it dries flat and even or with a load of horrible drying lines somewhere that you didn't want them. Viscosity is the answer. We're going to look at this in a really practical way today, including things like brush techniques, application, mixing, and a few helpful hints and tips. So let's jump straight in. So I've got some alizarin crimson here, and this top paint is quite thick and sticky. I've mixed hardly any water in with it. And now I have a much more watered down version. It's easy to think of these as both exactly the same, apart from the obvious colour difference, but actually they're quite different because this is majority water and this is majority paint, by which I mean pigment and binders, and they're going to behave quite differently on the paper, although they do have some things in common. Now, one thing they have in common, we can see the outside edge, it's a little bit different. They've got a bit more of a dry brush effect here where it's skipping across the paper a bit. And this one is smoother, but neither of them have bled. They haven't bled outside of the area where they've been applied. And you might think that this is due to the paint, but actually it's more about the paper. So I've got some tissue paper here, which is more of an untreated paper. So let's apply the paint to this. And I don't know if you can see, I'll hold it close to the camera, but there's a lot of bleeding. It's actually moving outside of the area in which I applied it. And that's because watercolor paper has something called sizing. It's often made from gelatine. Sometimes it's made from vegetable cellulose. That's the one I choose, and it's what stops the paint from bleeding. It helps it to apply nicely, and it doesn't bleed when it's applied to a dry surface. Now, if you apply your watercolor paint to watercolor paper and it does bleed, what that means is that something's happened to the sizing. Now, there's several reasons for that. It could be that your paper is old and damaged. Could be that when you were stretching your paper, if that's something you do, you soaked it for too long and removed the sizing, or it could just be that you put so many layers of paint and water on your paper that you messed up the sizing. But on nice fresh paper like this, we should get a nice crisp line. Now let's look at applying a flat wash to our paper. So I've mixed in enough water here for the paint to be quite fluid. And I've got a brush that's large enough to hold a fair amount of paint. So one mistake that beginners sometimes make is to use a brush that's too small. They keep having to dip in. Now, uneven water levels will cause things to happen, and we'll look at that in a moment. But first of all, let's look at how we apply a flat wash. So we need the water levels to remain even across this area, spreading the paint like this. So not only am I using a brush that's large enough to hold a lot of paint, but I'm spreading the paint down evenly. Now, I'm not going to get down here and then look up here where my paint has started to dry and think, oh, I've got a mistake here, or there's a cat hair, or there's a something, and dip my brush in here. And you might think to yourself, well, what if I have a huge area? You know, I'm trying to keep those water levels even across the whole area. But actually, you only need to keep this leading edge wet. Everything else will take care of itself. Well, I'm getting a little bored with the red paint now. Let's mix some blue in and make a nice purple. Now, it's actually much easier to control the paint on your brush than on your paper. So it's a good idea to have either some cotton rag or some paper towel on hand. And then if you feel like you're getting too much water, you can just, too much paint, I should say, you can just dry your brush like that. And we're going to look next at other ways in which we can use our brush to control what's happening to the paint on the paper. So I've added a little water here and gone a little lighter. So a brush can do something really cool. It can act almost like a little vacuum. So we can apply some paint and we can use a brush that's been dried, possibly rinsed and dried if you want to remove the paint that was in it. And we can squeeze the brush like this, and then the brush will lift paint off of the paper. Now we can do it like this to make a visible mark. It's quite good for soft highlights, but it can also be used in a less visible way. So let's imagine I'd applied some paint to an area and there's just too much of it because puddling is the enemy of things drying flat. So what I want to do here is I want to remove some of this paint, but I don't want to leave a line like this. So I'm going to start the same way, rinsing and drying my brush. What I'm going to do now is take little dots like this. And because these little dots are so tiny, what will happen is the paint will just move across and fill in the area. And in this way, we can stop the paint forming puddles on the paper. Now, you may have learned at school that water always wants to seek a level, and this is the reason that wet paint will always want to spread across an area that is simply damp. There's a little bit more to it than that, but if you remember that wet will spread towards damp, then you'll understand why you get disastrous things like this happen when you're trying to paint two crisp areas next to each other and you end up with a bleed line. Now, if I had allowed the green to dry before applying the purple, I would have a nice crisp edge here. But as it is, the wet paint wants to travel into the damp area. So how can we use this concept in our own painting? And what happens if we apply thick, sticky paint that's less wet than the first layer? And please don't worry about whether I'm using tube or pan paints. You can make thick, sticky paint or thin, watery paint from either. What I'm going to do now is take paint that's thicker and stickier than the surface I'm painting it on. We've still got some softness there. It's not entirely without bleeding, but it pretty much stays where I put it. Let's try the same thing with different water quantities. So again, I'm going to apply the green paint and allow it to dry slightly, but not fully. Now I'm going to take some very wet paint down the center. Now what we'll get here is much more bleeding. We'll get a much more feathery approach. None of these things are mistakes. We can choose to get an area that's defined with a slight softness to the edge, or an area that bleeds like this. It can be very useful for things like grasses and some types of flower petal. And notice that it's still not bleeding outside of the area. It's still not bleeding onto dry paper, which means we can control where it bleeds and where it doesn't bleed. And it's not just paint that it works with. We can also do this with clean water and see how the wet paint travels across the damp area. Now, so far we've been using quite controlled swatches, but if you've been painting an area with lots of different colours, you may have found that sometimes you get uncomfortable drying lines and there seems to be a line of pigment along the edge, so you get a little dark line. So why does this happen? Now, we spoke about puddling and it causing drying lines, but another phenomenon that happens, which is due to surface tension, is that the pigment, as a puddle dries, because we've got the surface tension, we can't see it, but it's curved up in the middle here, and it's often exacerbated by the paper itself buckling. What happens is, as the paint starts to dry, the pigment will be pushed to the outside. It's starting to happen here, but it's going to take a while for this to dry. I'll put a picture up so you can see how this little sample dried in the end. So if you're getting areas of very uneven paint and drying lines with lines of pigment at the edge of the drying line, the puddling is the problem. We're about halfway through, and before we continue exploring these really interesting watercolour ideas, I'd love it for you to hit that like button, hit that thumbs up, share this video with somebody you think might find it useful, leave me a comment, and most of all, I'd like you to subscribe to the channel. I'm on my way to 200,000 subscribers, and unlike most channels on YouTube, we are fully cat approved. Now, as watercolorists, we don't always get to choose how wet our paint is. If we need a light colour, we need to water it down a lot. But one thing I noticed when I started working in watercolours is that the wetter the paint is, the more it tends to splatter and flick. Now, although viscosity of paint is not directly related to surface tension, it is my belief that by watering the paint down significantly, we're changing the surface tension, and therefore these little splatters like this one here are much more likely to happen. So therefore, if you're painting with very wet paint, and if your paper is on the edge of losing a little bit of its sizing, watery paint like this is much more likely both to splatter and to bleed. So it's really important that you paint quite slowly when using very diluted paint such as this. Another thing that can happen with a watery mix of paint is it can be affected by granulating pigments. So I've mixed some cerulean and some yellow and some red into this mix here, and it's come out looking kind of brownish. Here's the cerulean I used. Now, cerulean is a granulating paint, which means that it dries with visible little granules. It's very pretty, but it also means that those blue granules are heavier than the other paints, and so they'll sink to the base of this area. So what looks like a reddish brown here may actually not be that colour at all. So if I tip the paint here, can you see, I'm trying to angle it so you can see, can you see all of the red coming down here? Red pigments are generally smaller, and then we have the blue and the green sitting up the top here. Look at this separation that's going on here. Now, there's nothing wrong with this paint, but it is important to note that before applying it, you see how I stir and it becomes a green? Before applying it, I'm going to need to, each time I dip in, I'm going to need to stir. Otherwise, I'm going to get a very uneven colour application, because in this watery mix, the heavier pigments are going to sink to the bottom. Let's go back to our first sample where this alizarin crimson, this red paint, has now dried. Something I noticed when I first started painting, and it happened so many times I thought it can't be coincidence, is whenever I went to paint next to an area of red paint or any paint that had red in it, such as purple or orange, I found that these colours are just, they seem more likely to bleed than other colours. In other words, if we paint up to an area of red paint, there just seemed to be a lot more colour transfer, a lot more of this colour here coming in to the colour that was painted next to it. Didn't seem to happen with things like blue. You see it happening here, the red is bleeding. Now, as time has gone on, I found out a little bit more about paint pigments, and I discovered that red pigments, as I mentioned earlier, have a tendency to be the pigments that fade more. They tend to be smaller paint pigments, and they tend to be more affected by things like sunlight. So it made perfect sense after that why pigments with red in are much more prone to bleeding when you paint up to the edge of them. Therefore, if you have a painting where you have a lot of, say, bright red or bright purple flowers, you want to put those colours in as late as possible. Let's talk about how paper surface affects how your paint moves on it, both thicker and thinner paint. So I've got some hot press paper here. It's been pressed to have a smooth surface. This paper here is much more textured. Now, the little bumps in our watercolour paper are there to help the colours look nice, but they also encourage the paint to spread out evenly across the paper. They make it easier to do things like this. Smoother paper or hot press paper doesn't spread the paint as evenly. It's much more likely to encourage paint to sit in puddles. You see, it doesn't have that texture that spreads that paint across the surface. Paint is much more likely to sit in puddles like this, and then as it dries, we'll start to get uneven drying, which means the areas where the paint is spread thinner will dry fast, leaving islands of puddly paint, which will then try to spread into those semi-dry areas and make a whole load of drying lines. Now, there's nothing wrong with hot press paper. I find it particularly useful if I want to do something mixed media. For example, if I also wanted to apply soft pastels or charcoal, they simply wouldn't apply well to a very textured paper like this. So I would choose a hot press paper, do my underneath watercolour painting, and then apply my pastels or charcoal on top. But given the choice, I would always choose this one for watercolour painting. You see how beautiful and evenly it's drying, how it traps and shows off the pigments to their greatest advantage, compared to this one here, which will encourage puddling and uneven drying. Now, just because you understand the things that I've talked about in this video doesn't mean that you'll necessarily be able to do them straight away. These things take physical practice as well as mental understanding. So don't be too hard on yourself. I'd love to know in the comments which one of these ideas you found most useful. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. Any other videos that I've mentioned that may be helpful to you will be listed down there. You can also find out about my free and paid watercolour painting and drawing courses. And if you enjoyed this video, but you feel sometimes that maybe your drawing lets you down when it comes to your watercolour painting, I'll put up a video right now that's going to help you immediately.